This is Terms of Reference podcast number 147.
So there is an enormous disbalance between mining companies and government that they can access to the best university and the best studies of the world, and local communities that often they cannot access to science, to legal advice, to nothing. So we try to rebalance this, bringing to communities science and legal advices.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Let's say you woke up tomorrow to the sound of someone knocking at your door. And when you answer, the person standing outside politely explains that they were a representative of an energy company that had recently acquired the rights to extract the natural gas in the area. Oh, and by the way, a great deal of that resource happens to be located under your house. Or what if you were able to track changes in the water your community uses for drinking, cooking, bathing, and cleaning physically change over the past few years from a pure, clean resource to one that's smelly or polluted or fouled in some other way? And that those changes began when a mining operation started upstream. Now here's the kicker. You're unable to bring a complaint against these resource extraction companies simply because you lack the time, money, or other resources. Or, an even more likely scenario, if and when you do bring your issues to your local or national authorities, you find that the scales are tipped against you simply because the companies have access to seemingly unlimited amounts of time, money, and insider knowledge. My guest for the 147th Terms of Reference podcast, Flaviano Bianchini, is intimately familiar with stories similar to these from around the world. But rather than just listen, he has helped create a powerful solution that has helped communities to fight back and tip the scales in their favor. Flaviano's organization, Source International, helps communities that are adversely affected by resource extraction activities, like mining or oil drilling, by providing them with scientific and legal resources. As you'll hear us discuss, the support provided by Source has created profound results: large-scale monetary rewards, injunctions against extraction activities, and, in one case, completely rewriting mining laws. I spoke with Flaviano in Italy. Now, before we get started, a word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Flaviano. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you to you, Stephen.
Flaviano, you are a world traveler. I know that we had taken some time to get this interview scheduled because you were in Peru. You were gallivanting around the world like so many of our guests. Where do we find you today?
Well, today you find me at home in Italy. So it's quite rare, but sometimes it happens.
Is it so rare that you know Italy is home, but you're not really sure if it's home? It's that kind of stuff, Fantastic. You are the founder and director of an organization called Source, which is
Source International, yes.
It's a fantastic name. I love it. Why don't we, like we like to do on these podcasts, why don't we start out by you telling us what Source International does? What's your mission? What's your goal? How do you do things differently?
Well, Source International, our final goal is to change the way in which minerals, natural resources are extracted all over the world. So we do this equipping local communities with scientific and legal tools that they can use for control their environment and their resources, so that they can have some sort of leverage that they can use to hold mining companies accountable.
What does that mean that you use scientific tools? I read in some of the background research I was doing for this interview that the way that it was essentially put in one sentence is that you bring scientific data and you provide it free to communities so that they can defend themselves. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. So we basically do two different things. On one side, we perform scientific studies for communities. So there is an enormous disbalance between mining companies and government that they can access to the best university and the best studies of the world and the best scientists, and also the best lawyers, and local communities that often they cannot access to science, to legal advice, to nothing. So we try to rebalance this balance, bringing to communities science and legal advices. And on the second level in which we work is to train local communities, so indigenous leaders, indigenous groups, and local farmers to perform some basic monitoring system. So we teach them how to use science in order to hold companies accountable. So we can sort of transform the community in a sort of watchdog, mining companies, oil companies, or resources extraction.
The first question I want to ask is, how dangerous is this work?
A little bit.
I mean, I'm lucky enough to, my degree, my master's is in conflict resolution myself, and I did a lot of work in the private sector with mining and the energy sector. There's a lot of ugly stories out there of people like yourself ending up on the wrong end of a pair of cement shoes. Do you ever feel like you're in danger? You ever been intimidated?
It happens sometimes. I would say it happened to me too. I was back in 2006, 2007, when I was in Guatemala. I've been traded and then expulsed from the country. It happened again in Mexico a few years ago when we had some bad stories in the state of Guerrero in the south. It still happened today to some of our partners. It's just 1 year ago when they killed Berta Cáceres in Honduras. So yeah, it happens sometimes. But unfortunately, actually, who is really at risk is more our local partners and local communities. We are sort of, it's sad to be said, but we are sort of protected from the fact that most of our organization are European or from the US. So, it's more, it's sad, but it's a sort of protection behind your European passport,
Mm-hmm. Do you find that the communities worked in, again, I'm only drawing from my own experience. I've been lucky enough to do some impact assessments in Uzbekistan and other places like that. Do you find that these communities are really, obviously they're very much at risk and they're very much being exploited, but are they under that sort of pressure as well? It's like, hey, show up and do this or else, or is it just they don't really know any different? Or maybe I'm too ignorant to ask the right question here.
It depends a lot from different countries. From countries to countries also change who is the danger. Sometimes it's the company, sometimes it's the government, sometimes our local armed group, not linked directly to neither the government or the company, like in Mexico. In some area of Mexico, it's very dangerous, and it is for the presence of what we call drug cartels. But often those drug cartels operate in mining rich area, resource rich areas, because drug is just one of their business. They also deal with minerals and natural resources. And then we have some conflict area, like if you think at the North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you have those armed groups that basically finance themselves almost 100% with the smuggling of coltan, that is this mineral that is used for technology. So, and then you have some case like in Mongolia where you have the government that has put into jail one of the biggest activists of the country with an accusation of terrorism while he was just in a manifestation against a mining process. So it changed a lot from country to another one. But generally speaking, local communities are in danger for two different sides. From one side is the danger of the impact that those extractive projects can have on their health, on their environment, on their life. And then if they protest against, then they are in danger of their life directly.
One of these protests that are going on right now in the country I come from is the Keystone Pipeline. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am familiar with that.
Is there any work or any data that you're providing to that particular struggle right now?
No, not really. We are not working. No. Unfortunately, no. We would like to help them, but we don't have still some contact with them. That's a sort of typical case. It's in a developed country, a country that is supposed to have a functional and fair judicial system, but it is also a country that does not recognize the indigenous rights and indigenous communities. And in that case, too, the protest against the project has been criminalized for quite a while. So that was quite famous because it's in the US, because
it's the land of the free, right? Free speech, freedom of protest, right?
Yeah, that's the reason. But you have hundreds of stories like this in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. So it's just one of those hundreds of cases.
Take me to a place where, I don't want to go too far down the dark hole here, but what about the positive impacts that your process has had? I'd love to hear about some of the successes that you've been able to put on the table for some of these communities.
Well, we've been able, for example, to have $50 million in compensation for an indigenous community in Mexico, $50 million in 5 years for compensation for the use of land and the pollution of the water. So the community can afford to bring a new pipeline for the water. And then we have obtained the declaration of emergency in a city in Peru called Cerro de Pasco. And probably our biggest achievement is that we have obtained that the Supreme Court of Honduras declared unconstitutional 13 articles of the mining law because it violates the human rights to health. So after that, the parliament was obliged to issue a new law that is more respectful for health, for human rights, for environment.
That blows my mind. I mean, that's 13 articles. Tell me about that legal struggle there. How long did that take? Was that just years and years of work, or was it just so obvious that it was a slam dunk?
Not really. It was almost 1 year, more or less. So we were
only
collecting
only
evidence.
1 year. That's amazing.
Yeah, we collect evidence for 1 year, more or less, and then we complain to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in a few months, declaring that those 13 articles there were violating the human rights to health. And that was, a great achievement because at the end of the day, it affected the entire population of Honduras.
Yeah, it's huge. And Honduras has some pretty nasty problems going on right now. So that's amazing.
That was a few years ago, but yeah, it was already a pretty nasty situation.
Are you the only organization that sort of follows this process of, and maybe let me ask by asking the first question, walk me through your process of how do you identify an area that you're going to work with, or do they come to you? Do you come to them? How do you decide on what scientific data you need to provide? Who gets that data? Walk us through the process of how it works.
Well, we never reach a community first. We always ask for the community to call us because, if we go to a community and we impose ourselves, it wouldn't be in a sort of another way of colonialism, So we always need a call from the community. And we receive, of course, a lot more calls than what we can afford. So we have to select, we have to do a sort of triage of the projects.
Let me just ask before you go down how you do your selection process. These are resource poor communities. These are, these are in areas of the world that are usually remote. How do they find you? Do they know to look up Source International?
Well, we have at this moment 27 projects. 26 of them, they know about us just by word of mouth.
Wow.
So just speaking among them and neighbor communities and other communities and a friend of a friend or something like that. And then one community reached out through internet, so through our webpage. But yeah, 26 on 27 is just word of mouth.
Fantastic.
And that's, it's a good indicator for us, the fact that we are doing a good job, because you can sell yourself pretty well on internet if you have a good designer, web designer, or communication skill. But word of mouth, it needs that you do a good job, and then
your people are recommending you.
Job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are saying these people helped us, these people worked for us. Yeah, that's fantastic. You're contacted, and then you have too many requests, so then you perform sort of, as you were saying, your triage.
Yeah, we have to select somehow, and we select basically on 3-4 major point, let's say. The first one is how big is the problem? Of course, if we have a mining project that impacts 100,000 person, we give it more priority than a small mine that impact 200 person. And then, of course, the resources that we have and the strength of the local communities, because that's fundamental for us. If the local community is not strong enough in terms of self-organization, in terms of, let's say, willing and able to struggle and to follow up with the process, that's the key.
How do you go about determining that strength? Is there, I assume maybe you do a site visit and you look for...
No,
or
word of mouth again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Look at me. Okay.
We start to ask to other communities that we know, and because they know us through word of mouth, so we can do the opposite process and then ask a feedback to someone or other organization. We have, of course, a strong network with local organizations in all the countries where we work, so we can ask to those organizations, because we can provide them science and we can provide them legal advice, but then they must follow up the struggle. They must go They have to go through the process. They have to deal with the company. They have to set up a negotiation table. They have to sit on the negotiation table. We cannot do it for them. So we need groups that are able and willing to do it.
Hey guys, I just want to pause right here for a second. You've been listening for about 20 minutes. If you like what you're hearing, if you like listening to Flaviano talk about how he's helping these communities and how Source International is helping these communities, can you take a moment to open up iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or SoundCloud or whatever your podcast app happens to be and click subscribe? Also, consider giving the show a rating because it really does help. And finally, if you like what you're hearing here, this episode, or the podcast in general, please just share it on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Now back to the show with Flaviano. And then, so after you've determined that the community is strong enough, you come up with your strategy, or what's the next?
Well, the next step is going there and start to work. And so we visit and we stay for a while. Normally we have a first visit that is not that long, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks sometimes, where we do a sort of assessment, initial assessment. And then we define a strategy that can be 1 year long or 2 years long or whatever. And then we start with collecting samples, analyzing samples, teach the methodology of monitoring, and then start to report and evaluate and report.
And then we the samples you're talking about are like soil samples, water quality samples, these kinds of things?
Yeah, we can do pretty much everything from water quality, water quantity, soil, dust, hair. We also do biological samples like blood, urines, or hair analysis, so by accumulation of heavy metals or dioxins or whatever. We analyze food sometimes. We can perform any kind of studies on environment and health and biological samples or organic samples or whatever. Then, of course, it changes from case to case.
Sure. So how does this continue to, I'm wondering, how do you scale yourself? What does the next 2 or 3 years look like for you? I'm looking on your website, you've got 5 staff members. I don't know if that's correct or not, or if those are just the first, the 5 people that are responsible for, making the pieces move. But is this a big enough issue that you need to continue to grow and scale, or what's your strategy for your organization for the next, 3 or 5 years?
That's a sensitive question because we don't have really a strategy. It's a little bit more like
no one does.
Following the flow.
Well, and I'll tell you what. Our previous guest that was on a couple of weeks ago. His name is Kenneth Stanley. He actually preaches the gospel of don't have a strategy. So basically go with the flow and the outcome will present itself to you. So that's the greatest wisdom.
That's pretty much what we do. We go with the flow somehow and try to navigate a little bit in this flow and see what happens. But yeah, we need to define actually a strategy, and we just start process yesterday actually with a Shoka globalizer, that is team that will help us in define a sort of a strategy for the next 5 years. Yeah, because I agree with your previous guest. You don't have to be strict on your strategy. That somehow you have to follow the flow, but somehow you have to navigate into this flow too. So it's not just we are too much now probably in follow the flow and nothing else. So I think it's just compromise, having some strategies and follow the flow a little bit, not be too strict inside the strategy, but at the same time, you can not only just follow the flow and go.
I know that you were an Ashoka Fellow. Is that where this idea came from, or was this something that you've been sitting on for a long time and you've only now been able to actualize it for the last several years? Or where did the idea for Source, what was the genesis for it?
Well, the genesis is pretty strange. 11 years ago, I met a Guatemalan lady in Italy in a conference, and she had this speech, very emotional speech on mining pollution in her country, and that was very close to my graduation. So she had this powerful speech, but without any data at all. So at the end of the conference, I proposed myself to help them with providing scientific data. And she said yes. And so a couple of months later, I was on a plane to Guatemala with a one-way ticket. And I spent almost 1 year and more than a year and a half in Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador, taking evidence about mining pollution in those countries. So that was the first step. And then from there, I started to do other projects, and I came back to Italy to study again. And then I moved to Peru and Argentina and so on and so forth. And then 6 years later, I started to develop the idea of having an organization that do this scientific support, but not just Flaviano going around the world, but having a real organization who do that. But I wasn't able to realize this before the Ashoka Fellow come. So was key to source actually to me as Flaviano, but also to source the fact that I'm an Ashoka Fellow, because that was what enabled me to actually found Source International and then start this journey.
I love that story. I mean, it's fantastic that you just sort of took the leap, before you graduated. You heard a story, you were passionate about it, and you've been following that path ever since. It's the same sort of glow with the flow strategy, but there's a common thread of this scientific data, right?
Somehow I saw a need, and I was young and somehow a little bit crazy, and then I just say, okay, let's try.
What do you have to lose? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
How has the collection of this scientific data changed over the last 5 or 6 years for you? I mean, is it still, going with the borehole and, going into the ground to take the soil sample and dipping the beaker in the water to grab the water sample and those kinds of things? Or are you implementing other types of innovative technology or innovative processes that allow you to either cover more ground or do things remotely or anything like that?
Well, generally speaking, it has remained the same. When you work in your lab at Berkeley University or whatever, you can use the most innovative technology or whatever. But when you're in the middle of the jungle in Peru, it's better if you use some older technology that is more reliable. So at the end of the day, we use technologies that is 20, maybe even 30 years old. That is pretty simple, but pretty effective and officially recognized. So it's still taking water samples and soil samples. The only thing that we have changed a little bit, 2 things. The first one is on the biological samples that we used to analyze a lot of blood. And now we are switching to hair. So the lung bioaccumulation, and especially because it's easier from the bureaucratic and legal point of view. If you take blood to someone and then you have to transport it outside the country and then transport inside another country, you need hundreds of paper, while if you take hair,
sure, it's easier. A biohazard. Yeah, okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, blood is a biohazard, so you need hundreds of paper, and often the government is not the most collaborative. So you can actually, it happened in the past that we have our blood samples stocked in some place for months, while with hair it's much easier, because if not, any barbers should be a paper to take hair. You don't need any kind of paper. And the other thing is, we are a little bit working with some other small NGO and some investigation center in order to develop some toolkit for analysis of like rapid screen analysis of heavy metals in water that can use a foam. Basically, the system of analyzing the presence of heavy metals in the water, it's pretty old. It's like probably 100 years old. And you put a couple of drops of reactives and the water change color. Let's say that if you have lead and I put there like 3 drops of this, 2 drops of that, the water become blue. The intensity of the blue, it depends from the concentration of lead. The difficult thing is that our eye is not sensible enough to see this difference of the intensity of blue.
But the phone camera has a spectrum that can see the different hues?
Not really, but we are working on it. So you can have sort of machine with a laser that measures the intensity of blue with a phenomenal precision, and you're going to find a microgram per liter. You won't find that with the camera of your phone, of course, but you can go much, much closer than with your normal eye. So it will take probably a couple of years more, but there are already some systems that are used to it.
I'm going to assume that the mining companies and the oil companies are not your funders.
No, they're not.
Where do you get the money to do this? Are you applying for grants? Do the communities pay for your services? How does this work?
It works in a complex system. So we have different revenue streams. Grants and donation from foundation is still the biggest. And then we have 2 other streams. And well, sometimes we have local communities who pay for us, or not directly the communities. Often there is an intermediary, is a local NGO. So the community call a local NGO, the local NGO pay for our service. And then we have 2 different ways that are So we cannot take money from mining company or oil company because it would be a conflict of interest, of course. But sometimes you have the investors of the mining companies that are willing to know what happens inside there.
So you're like a risk prevention.
Exactly. On the long term, it's a risk prevention. Although it's pretty difficult to let them understand that it's really a risk prevention and it's not just something for human rights or environment. It's not just protecting the environment. It's actually, from a business point of view, a risk prevention.
Sure, and going forward, we have to assume that more and more of the universe will land in your favor, right? Because the data continues to pile up about, if we're going to be doing extractive industries, then we know that they cause damage, and you got to either do it right or not do it. So I can see from a long-term risk, a risk perspective, that's very intense.
It is a risk perspective from a long-term view from an investor, and it is also from a government. It's supposed to be theoretically, because with a mining company you can earn money on the short term, but then if they let everything polluted, you will lose more money than what you earn at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the clear example, the most common example, is the state of Colorado in the U.S.
Oh no! It's my home. That's my home state.
Oh, that's your own state.
I hope you're not going to talk about Rocky Flats, are you?
No. No. But the state of Colorado today, it's losing $17 million a year just for the pollution that was caused 150 years ago when they were looking for gold.
Is this from the acid mine drainage from up in Golden and Leadville? Yeah.
Exactly. So all that acid mine drainage came from 150 years ago is polluting the water so bad that water cannot be used for nothing, for fishing, for drinking, and neither for industrial purpose, because it's so acid that you cannot put that water into a turbine for generate electricity, for example. So
you've just taken me. I have to say, I'm going to credit you. You're the 140th person or so that I've talked to on this podcast, and you're the first one to throw me all the way back to my youth, because my very first internship in college was working for the U.S. Geological Survey on acid mine drainage. I was doing what you did. I would go out and measure the water quality once a week and bring it back and put it in an spectrograph and then do the regressions. That is hilarious. And you're saying $17 million a year still. Holy smoke, they lost a lot of money on that.
In the entire U.S., it's much more, of course. It's 22,000 kilometers of rivers in the U.S. polluted from acid mine drainage.
Wow.
There is this funny comparisons that is made by Earthworks. That is, if you put all the water that mining companies pollute in the U.S. every year, and you put all in the bottles, you're going to cover the distance from the Earth to the moon 54 times, go and back.
Oh, no. Somebody make that infographic immediately. Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's online if you can look at it.
We'll find it and we'll put it in as a part of the blog post. I want to ask an opposite question here. Have you ever sort of had a pretty massive failure where you went in and said, look, we're going to help, or we're going to find the scientific data, and then either, you just didn't come up with anything and you said, look, hey, actually it's not that bad? Or have you ever had an incident where you've gone in and there's just the positive benefits of the extractive industry or the positive benefits of the mining have so far outweighed the negative that you said, look, you don't got it so bad?
That would be great, but unfortunately it's not.
Oh,
because
I was hoping you'd say, yeah, there was this one time.
No. Generally speaking, that would have been the perfect outcome. You go there, you realize that there's nothing. So say the community can continue to control, but of course, they can have drinking water and whatever. That's not because there's no clean mining all over the world. The point is that when they call us, it's always when there is already a problem. Mm. So when we arrive, it's normally already a damaged situation.
Are there other organizations out there that do this? I know you've won a number of innovation awards. You've won a number of tech awards. Is there anyone out there you either consider peers or competition that are also doing this kind of work?
There are other organizations who are doing this kind of work, especially from the legal perspective, so the legal help and the advocacy and lobby work. We are pretty unique on this use of science. The key aspects of Search International, the real innovation, is the fact that we use the science in order to generate advocacy or legal processes or whatever. And in that case, we are pretty unique. There is a small group in the US, in New Mexico, called eTech. They are doing something similar, but they are more toward the companies sometimes. Well, we are just 100% working always and only with communities.
So Flaviano, I always have these last two questions in this innovation series. Who do you pay attention to in order to stay up to date, look for the latest and greatest in your particular sector? Are there blog posts you read? Are there Twitter feeds you follow? Are there magazines you read? Is there anything that you think our audience would benefit from as far as a data stream?
No, I don't think so. It's again a sort of follow the flow. I don't know. I don't really look for news that much. I mean, on this topic, but then somehow the news arrived to me in a way or another.
I love that you fully commit yourself to the universe. That's fantastic. Last question that I have is there anything outside your area? You know, you think and live Source International every day of the week. Is there anything that's outside your area that maybe it could benefit you, but you know, is specific to helping people around the world in aid situations or development situations that you just think is really cool, and you'd like to give a shout out to?
Oh, well, there's a lot.
What are one or two things that you think they're just fantastic, are going to have a big impact that you don't necessarily deal with every day?
I'm thinking, for example, to ELO, that is the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide. It's an organization based in Oregon, and it's a network of lawyers, environmental lawyers all over the world, and they are doing a pretty good job every day. And yeah, they are someone to look for. Yeah, definitely, probably the highlight. And then, well, of course, I think if I have to suggest someone, let's say an organization that do fantastic and terrific works, is Global Witness in the UK. I mean, they are based in the UK, but they are global, and they are really great. And then when they publish something, it's good stuff always.
It's always good stuff. Yeah, they've been around for a long time, man. I used a lot of theirs for my master's program. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and the first battle was there in Thailand with the timber commerce.
The timber extraction, that's right.
Yeah, 20 years ago or something like that, maybe even more.
Flaviano, this has been a very interesting conversation. I really appreciate you introducing us to how you guys use science in order to help these communities, and I wish you all the best.
Well, to you too, and to all the listeners.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.